You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Orn Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 34 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Nichola Raihani. Nicola is a Royal Society University Research Fellow and Professor in Evolution and Behaviour at UCL, otherwise known as University College London. She is leader of the Social Evolution and Behaviour Lab at UCL, and her research focuses on the evolution of social behaviour in humans and non-human species. And today we'll be discussing her debut book, The Social Instinct: How Cooperation Shaped the World. Nicola, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, Owen. Thanks very much for having me.
You're welcome. So when reading this book, it felt deeply scientific, and obviously as a professor, it's evident the fact that it's very in-depth and scientific, and it's an interesting topic given the nature of cooperation at the moment in today's society. So before we get into some of the topics of the book, I think it would be good to discuss why you believe that this topic is so important to discuss.
I think it goes to the heart of kind of understanding our place on Earth and our existence, not only as a multicellular beings, but as one of the most social species on the planet. And so I've always been pretty interested in the question of why individuals help one another, because if we take a very narrow reading of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, the emphasis there seems to be on competition, on struggle for survival, on every individual for himself or herself. And if we take that as read and we accept that view with its kind of narrow emphasis on self-interest, then the fact that we see so many instances of cooperation in the natural world starts to look a bit puzzling, because this seems to kind of be at odds a little bit with this Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. And for me, the thing that I find that have always been very interested by is how can we reconcile the fact that we do see helping behavior in nature and that we do see cooperation in nature, and especially, in our own species, we see a lot of cooperation. How can we reconcile that with this grand unifying theory of evolution by natural selection? And that's I think, for a lot of people who work on social evolution, that is kind of the big question and the thing that people have always found interesting.
What is a brief, let's say, like a Spark Notes version of the social evolution then that Darwin was talking about? If someone was to do like an elevator pitch, how would you describe it?
I guess so. In his book, there's a really nice passage on the origin of species, which I would recommend anyone to read, because it's a lovely book to read. Darwin wrote really well and his writing is really colourful and vivid. But there's a passage in the book where in a chapter, he deals with all the kind of potential difficulties for his theory. And he actually calls the presence of worker castes in social insect societies. These are the non-reproductive worker individuals that we see in ants and wasps and bees and things like that. He actually highlights this as what he calls his one special difficulty, and the thing which, for him, if his theory is correct, this is a thing which could potentially be fatal to the wholesale adoption of his theory. But then he goes on in a way, and it's just a sign of how prescient he was and how deep his insights were. He goes on to recognize that actually the fact that these non-reproductive individuals exist, and they can't propagate their kind, as he puts it. So this is the big puzzle. Why do these non-reproductive helpers exist that actually can't pass this trait for being non-reproductive on to anyone, because they, by definition, don't reproduce? But he goes on to realize that if you consider that the evolution of these societies is often they live in grand family groups, and you can think about selection as being applied at the level of the family rather than at the level of the individual. That helps to reconcile the difficulty, and in fact that foreshadows then the development of what we now call inclusive fitness theory, where the basic premise is that a gene that is present in my body doesn't really care how it gets into the next generation. If it gets into the next generation through my own offspring, or because I help my siblings or my parents to reproduce, that's kind of, the gene doesn't really care which route it takes to get into the next generation. And you can understand many examples of altruism in nature through this kind of expanded notion of self-interest.
That was one of the questions I did have for you, was the relationship between the individual gene and the individual as a whole. Because you gave a description and I think in the first part of the book, you were giving a description between the relationship between what the individual gene does and their relationship. But then you also said, I think if I remember rightly, was the fact that you can't see an individual gene as opposed to the individual as a whole, because the individual as a whole carries each individual gene. So can you just describe the relationship between the individual gene and the individual as a whole?
Sure. So I kind of think there's a really nice analogy you can use. Like, if you think about what you see when you look in the mirror, you see yourself as a coherent, individual being. But in fact, you're actually, yes, you're an individual, but you're also a collective, and you're made up of lots and lots of cells that are all working together, and inside those cells there's lots and lots of genes that are all cooperating and working together to create this higher level of organization, this thing that we call an individual. And one way you can think about how this nested structure works is oh, you've disappeared. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still there. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So one way you can think about how this individual structure works is by, when I was a kid, we used to call these things Russian dolls. They're like these wooden dolls you have, where there's a big one, and inside it there's a smaller one, and inside it there's a smaller one again, and a smaller one. And my nana used to have them. I always used to play with them and line them out on the sideboard. But essentially, that's kind of like the picture, if you like, in your mind that you can have as what you are, in a way. So what you see when you look in the mirror is that outermost Russian doll, but inside you there's another one, and inside that one there's another one again, and that's like the cells and the genes and whatnot. Inside those things there's always one of those dolls that's right in the middle, that it's the smallest one, and it can't be split any further. It's the tiniest one that lives in the middle. And that, in a way, is the analogy for the gene. So the gene is the most fundamental unit of replication, and a gene is basically just a bit of information, in a way, and it's that information which is the thing that replicates itself and which appears in subsequent generations. So there'll never be another copy of you in the world again, there'll never be another copy of me in the world again, but our genes probably will, or some of our genes will, live on. In mine are in my children, some of them are, and yours will be in some, your own children or your relatives and things like that. So in our bodies, genes work together to create this entity, which we call an individual, which is you and me and every other living thing on Earth. And that individual is a gene's way of trying to find its way into subsequent generations, essentially.
Is the function of a gene to replicate, is to ensure that it stays obviously alive, or to a degree? I don't know whether alive is the correct term, but is the purpose of the gene to maintain its integrity throughout the next generation, or is it to compete with other genes within the own individual body, or is it both?
It's both, really. I mean, I would hesitate to use the word function. I think it's more that genes which increase their representation in the gene pool in subsequent generations relative to the prevalence of other variants in the gene pool tend to, that's like a gene's version of winning, essentially. So genes are the genes that manage to increase their representation over and above the background level of representation in the population are doing better than other genes. And so all genes want, and I use that term very loosely because obviously genes don't want anything, they're just scraps of DNA. But if you allow the metaphor from it, what a gene wants is to keep on appearing and keep on appearing and keep on appearing in subsequent generations. And the ones that don't do that or don't want to do that will very quickly disappear from the gene pool. And the ones that are very good at doing that will continue to persist, and we will continue to see them and see evidence of them in subsequent generations.
One of the a great description you gave of genes sort of fighting out to a degree is in the book. You talked about the mother's curse, and you talked about mitochondrial genes placing advantage on the female genes when they when a child is getting formed. So can you discuss what this curse is and the impact of, I think you call it, introgenomic favoritism between the female and the male genes?
This is actually, I mean, there are some super interesting things when you start to take a gene's eye perspective on evolution. You start to see that actually, even though we see it, when you look in the mirror, you think you're this kind of coherent individual. It might not be that apparent that there are actually quite often conflicts that are being played out among the genes inside your body. And one example of that is, as you noted, is this mitochondrial conflict that plays out between genes that are present on the nucleus, which is inside every cell in your body, and genes that are present on the mitochondria. So to understand why there's a conflict, you first have to know that mitochondria, which is basically like the onboard battery of every cell, this is the thing that helps your cells to respire. The mitochondrial DNA only gets passed down the female line. So every mitochondria in every cell in my body came from my mother, and every mitochondrial cell in her body came from her mother. And for you, every mitochondria and every cell in your body came from your mother, and so on. What this means is that the DNA that's present inside mitochondria doesn't have any interest in finding its way into a male, or it doesn't have when it finds itself in a male organism, it's kind of a dead end for that mitochondria. There's no way for that DNA to then get passed on into subsequent generations. And what can happen because of that is that if there are genetic variants on that mitochondrial DNA that yield advantages to female offspring, but are detrimental to males, they can nevertheless be selected for, because all the mitochondrial DNA cares about is advantages to the female, because that's its only route into the next generation. One example of this in humans is that I talked about in the book is this disease called Leber's hereditary optical neuropathy, which is a disease that afflicts males, usually when they're in adolescence, and often results in them losing vision in both eyes, and it's carried on the mitochondrial DNA. So it yields some advantage, presumably, to females, or at least no disadvantage. But there's a really severe cost of carrying this DNA, on the mitochondria, if you happen to be a male and you inherit that from your mother.
Has that got anything to do with the health of the individual? So at the moment, I'm reading a lot about mitochondrial health and longevity and aging, because apparently I read a book recently called The Future of Medicine by James Temperton, which was written, and we were talking about mitochondrial health and how that has become one of the factors to increase longevity. So how does that mitochondrial preference to female genes, does that have any research back to suggest that if you the female side of your family has perhaps not the best mitochondrial health? God, it's a tongue twister, isn't it? Does that affect you as the individual, as the male?
I don't know about anything. I haven't read anything about that, but my understanding of how this what's called mother's curse, and it's mother's curse because it's inherited through the female line, is how it works is that if you carry that detrimental genetic variant, or if that detrimental genetic variant is present in the mitochondrial DNA, it will yield advantages to any female offspring that inherit it, but it will be detrimental to any males that inherit it. And there are actually some cases in some insect species where on the mitochondrial DNA, there are genes which select for where there are male killer genes, essentially, where it just results in the male offspring dying, essentially. So these can be really stark consequences that can nevertheless be selected for because of because of the positive effects that they have on some individuals that carry that DNA.
Yeah. I found that really interesting to read, because obviously I had absolutely no idea that was the case, and it's just interesting to see that genes have preferences, or mitochondria has preferences. The evolution of that is fascinating. One of the things you talked about as well was on the gene front was the genetic inevitability of cancer. So you gave this example to say that half of us will get cancer at one point in time, but in the book you sort of question is like, why don't we all get cancer if our cells copy, I think you said, at 100 million per minute? Can you just speak to that a bit and talk about, the effects of what happens when our cells replicate, and how or why, for instance, there's a fact that all of us don't get the inevitability of cancer at one point in time?
Yeah, so this is when your cells replicate, which they do frequently, there's an awful lot of information that has to be copied, and it has to be copied faithfully and accurately. And I think in the book I used an analogy like saying it would be like copying out, every time a cell divides, it's like copying out the contents of this book like 7 times without making a single mistake or something. I can't remember the exact number, but there's an awful lot of information that has to be copied, and there's no room for error, essentially. What can happen with how cancers emerge in a way often is that there will be what's called a mutation, which is a bit like it can emerge from a copying error, where some of this information that's being copied as a cell replicates itself is copied slightly incorrectly. And when you think about the number of times that cells in your body replicate, and the enormous amount of information that has to be copied faithfully, it does seem a little bit strange that we don't see more of these errors creeping in that can potentially give rise to some of the hallmarks of cancer, that can allow cells to develop some of these characteristics that are associated with cancerous cells. And one of the things, this is a thing which is called Peto's paradox, actually. One of the curious observations is that for larger, longer-lived species, you might expect that you would be more likely to make those copying errors, because you've got more cells that have to replicate themselves, and you're doing it over a longer period of time. So in some ways, you might think, well, the longer that a species lives, and the more of this copying that's going on, the more chance there should be that that these mutations are going to creep in, and there should be an increased risk of those sometimes developing into cancerous mutations. And so you might expect that the larger, longer-lived species would be more likely to develop cancer, and in fact, the opposite is true. They're less likely to develop cancer. And in our own species, we know that despite the fact that, yes, 1 in 2 of us will develop cancer at some point in our lifetimes, it's actually amazing that for the majority of our lifespans, for most of us, we don't develop cancer. And the paradox can be resolved when you think about what mechanisms are in place in your body to prevent those cancerous mutations from emerging, or to correct them if they arise. And that's basically what the body does. So as these cells are copying themselves and replicating, if errors creep in, there's almost like a proofreading function in the genome that's sort of like, does everything look how it should look? If so, I'll let this cell to continue to divide. If things don't look right, I'm going to stop it, and I'll tell the cell to abort, or to stop and not continue dividing. Those error checking mechanisms are under selection themselves, and they are under selection to be most assiduous early on in a creature's lifetime. And as an individual ages, and as they've passed through some of the major life history milestones like reproduction, and in humans also helping out potentially with grand offspring, the selection on those proofreading mechanisms to actually be assiduously checking that everything looks as it should before allowing cells to continue on their division journey just becomes weaker. And essentially, that's why we can have this kind of seemingly paradoxical situation where we are a really long-lived species. We seem to be really good at evading cancer, but almost because we are now so long-lived, and because several of the extrinsic threats that would normally ancestrally have been the reason for mortality in humans, we have managed to get rid of, like through improvements in healthcare and sanitation and things like that. Eventually, there is just less selection on those proofreading mechanisms that prevent these, that sort of prevent these cancerous mutations from taking hold. And eventually, as organisms age, the chances of developing cancer become increased just because those proofreading mechanisms are not as assiduous in old age. And that also helps to explain this what I called the Peto's paradox, which is that the longer lived organisms tend not to get cancer. There's selection. The reason why they are long lived in a way is partly because they have these selection on these proofreading mechanisms that prevents these multicellular bodies from developing cancerous tumors.
So those proofreading, where do they? This might be a silly question, but where do those sit? Do those sit in the actual gene, or do they sit in the actual cell? Are they part of each cell, or are they separate from each cell?
They would be inside each cell, and there are a bunch of genes that are involved in cellular division and replication that are involved in regulating that process. And so lots of those genes, when they become dysregulated, or if they are mutated in some way, are responsible then for the development of cancerous growths. And so there are some genes that will stop a cell from dividing, or will pause a cell in a division journey at some point. If those genes get dysregulated, they turn off that switch that stops the cell from dividing, and then you can get unchecked cell division, and that is one hallmark of cancer. But there are basically a bunch of genes, and that are all linked to different pathways involved in cell division and cell growth, that if they become dysregulated slightly by one or a few mutations, can then disrupt this very, very controlled process of division and growth, and lead to unchecked growth and unchecked cell division. And that is kind of what cancer is. Cancer is just is an aberration of the normal way that our cells grow and divide, and there's nothing kind of new in there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me because I wasn't aware really of the genetic inevitability of cancer. You always think cancer's this thing that, let's hope we don't get it. But then when you read that, you kind of think, well, why don't all of us get it at some point? It's amazing how that happens and how that transforms. Moving away from the individual gene, I know in the book you give examples about how you observed different species in the world. You traveled to the Kalahari Desert and you traveled to the Great Barrier Reef. Can you just talk about your experiences on the ground and how you are seeing how species cooperate and in the actual world, and some of your findings?
Sure. So I did my PhD actually in the Kalahari, and I worked on a species of bird called the pied babbler, which is a medium-sized bird that mostly forages on the ground. And they live in really tight-knit family groups. So they usually live in a group of around 6 to 14 individuals. And within each group, reproduction is monopolized by the dominant pair. So there's just one male and one female in each group that breed, and everyone else, who are usually the retained offspring of the breeding pair, everyone else in the group is not allowed to breed, and they basically have to help to raise the offspring of the dominant male and female. And that arrangement is called cooperative breeding. And there are other famous examples of cooperative breeders that people probably might be more familiar with, like meerkats, for example. And also ants and many wasps and bees are a very sort of extreme kind of cooperative breeder. And the interesting thing in these systems is to understand why do helpers accept their status as this kind of subordinate, non-reproductive individual, and how are the conflicts that are going to inevitably arise in a society like that over who gets to breed and who has to remain as a helper? How do those conflicts get resolved? So that was what I did my PhD out there, and we actually habituated the birds, which basically means that we spent quite a long time just getting them used to us. They're completely wild and they're extremely frightened of humans. And so we spent a very, very long time getting them quite used to us so that we could actually observe their behaviors at quite close. We could walk with the birds and they would not be alarmed by us. We could see what they were doing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I spent a long time. I think I said, I have a tweet or something like that, or someone asked me once, describe your PhD. And I think a lot of it is, I was just chasing birds around the desert for like 4 years of my life. And it's a lot of kind of trudging around, being quite patient. A lot of what a wild animal does is pretty mundane. Like their key concerns, if you like, is find food, avoid being eaten by something. Those are the two main things that they do a
Eat
lot of.
and don't be eaten.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of what you're observing is not that you have to spend a lot of time with the species to really start to get to know them, and also to be able to observe the things that are super interesting but don't happen all that often. Yeah. You just have to put in the hours and spend the time, and that was kind of what I did, and what the other researchers that worked on the meerkats and the babblers at that study site also did, was a lot of just hanging out with these animals essentially, and getting to know them and getting to know their behavior and things like that.
You said there that your PhD was very much related to the fact of how do those that are subordinate, how do they manage those conflicts? So how do they manage those conflicts? Because obviously in our society, the way we view our society as humans, it's very much there's obviously not an acceptance for subordination, obviously. Why is that in the animal kingdom, and how do they resolve disputes?
Well, in fact, humans are, even though we don't think of ourselves as being cooperative breeders necessarily, we actually are cooperative breeders, and our children are often a bit like, or maybe not so much in Western industrialized societies, but in contemporary forager societies and ancestral humans, our children are a bit like those subordinate, non-reproductive helpers that I studied in the pied babblers that don't start breeding. They don't start breeding as soon as they are physiologically able to do so, but they instead stay at home, maybe help out with their younger brothers and sisters, and are in some respects non-reproductive helpers. And in fact, humans also have another physiologically sterile helper morph, which is equivalent in some ways to the worker individuals of an ant society. And we call those individuals in our society grandmothers. And they are individuals that have undergone a physiological transition and become non-reproductive in doing so, the menopause. And they then switch lanes and become specialized as helpers. And that's how we understand the evolution of menopause in humans, and why humans have such a long post-reproductive lifespan. In the babblers, sorry, that was a long way to come back to your question. In the babblers and in the meerkats, often conflict is resolved in ways that we would probably think of as being quite barbaric. So if there's conflict among females about who is going to get to lay eggs in the nest, the females will quite often just kill and eat each other's eggs. In meerkat societies, the dominant female is the primary breeder in the group, but subordinates can sometimes manage to get pregnant if they go on if they meet a male from another group that they're not related to. They can get pregnant, and they frequently do get pregnant. If that happens, the dominant female is quite likely to evict the subordinate, who might be her daughter or her niece, is almost certainly a relative. She's quite likely to evict that female so that the female is stressed by living alone and will abort the litter that she's carrying. If a subordinate female manages to stay in the group pregnant and give birth to pups, and those pups are born before the dominant female has her own pups, then the dominant female will quite likely kill and eat those pups, so that, devouring their own grand offspring. So there are kind of a few ways that these conflicts sort of play out, and often the outcome is pretty grisly, I would say, at least from our point of view.
Yeah, you gave one example in the book. I can't remember what it was in reference to, but you gave the example about raising young, and there was a spider. I can't remember the name of the spider, but they rear the young for a bit, but then they allow the young to eat the mother allows the young to eat her to ensure that they have
the black lace spider. Yes.
Yeah.
That's amazing, isn't it? In fact, she doesn't allow it, she encourages it. So at some point she lays these eggs. This is like an extreme form of parental investment in a way.
Yeah.
She lays these eggs for the young to eat, and once they've eaten those, then she vibrates herself at some strange frequency that agitates the spiderlings and encourages them to basically begin feasting on her. So she makes the ultimate sacrifice for the babies.
Yeah, I thought that was crazy. Can you talk a bit about you in the book? You talked about the role of teaching in societies. So the role of teaching in our society, human society, versus the animal kingdom. And I think you gave the example of, I think it was the chimpanzees, when they said that they observe when they learn, they just observe, and it's not so much through communication; it's just through trial and error of observation. Can you just talk about the advantages that we have as humans in our ability to cooperate and communicate in learning, as opposed to perhaps chimpanzees or other animals in the animal kingdom?
Sure. So obviously, when we think of teaching, what springs to mind for many of us that live in modern industrialized societies is a classroom setting where it's quite institutionalized. You have a teacher at the front and a bunch of children all learning. And we can also be kind of duped into thinking that teaching is a uniquely human activity or a quintessentially human thing to do. But in fact, teaching is broader than that. And you can define teaching as being essentially any active instruction or any action that is designed to help an individual to learn, and which does help an individual to learn something. And when you have this kind of more inclusive definition of teaching, what you see is that actually there are examples of teaching in the animal kingdom, but they're in quite strange places, and places where we might not have necessarily thought to look, first of all. So the first sort of concrete example of teaching in a non-human species, even though people have been looking for this for a long time in chimpanzees and primates and things like that, the first concrete example we had came in 2006, and it was actually in an ant. And in the study, they found that ants actually teach their nest mates how to find a new nest site, or how to find their way to a good food resource. And they do this by allowing the pupil ant to walk. It's called tandem running, where they walk very, very close to one another, and they stay in very close contact with the leader, and the leader stops frequently to let the pupil do little exploratory searches so it can learn the landmarks on the route to this place where they're going. And it takes actually a lot longer for the ants to teach in this way, because what the ants could do if they wanted to get everyone to this place quickly is just pick up the ones that don't know the way and carry them to this place. But if they carry the ants, the naive ants there, they're not able to learn. They somehow need to be able to make these exploratory forays to learn the route, and they need to walk there themselves to learn where they're going. And so this was the first example we had that there was teaching in the animal kingdom, a behavior that's designed to help an individual learn something that they might not otherwise learn, or to learn something faster than they would be able to learn it by themselves. Another example came from meerkats, where a friend of mine, actually, Alex Thornton and Katie McAuliffe, showed that adults teach youngsters how to handle dangerous prey items like scorpions by provisioning them, first of all, with dead things, and then maimed scorpions with the sting removed, and then only when the pups are quite competent, giving them like a real live scorpion to handle and to de-sting and to eat. And if anyone who has a cat, if you have a pet cat, you might have, there's probably, we think probably cats do something like this as well, whereby they release live but disabled prey so that the kittens can learn how to handle this prey in a relatively safe environment. And sometimes if you have a pet cat, they might bring a half dead mouse or bird into the house. And that's kind of an expression of this sort of teaching behavior in a way. It's like, here, have a go at this. They're usually not very impressed because you don't kind of just screaming and run away. But,
throw it outside.
Yeah. So the main thing, and the main curious thing, I guess, with teaching is, why do we see it in these sort of weird and wonderful places like the meerkats and the ants, and also the babblers that I worked on teach their offspring as well, and yet we don't see it in our closest relatives, like where we really thought we would see evidence of teaching, like in chimpanzees and bonobos and orangutans. And I think part of the answer to the question is that teaching is most likely to evolve in species where the skill is really, really important for survival. So if you think about, for example, a cat or a cheetah, that's another example where we think teaching occurs. The need to be able to be a successful hunter for those individuals, if they're wild and they're living, most cats are solitary, they live by themselves. That's a really stark requirement, and you need to be able to effectively hunt and kill to be able to stay alive. And maybe you don't get that many opportunities to do that if your mother doesn't help you. So we think teaching is probably most likely to evolve in species where it's either really difficult to get those skills for yourself, or there's potentially a danger involved in getting those skills. Like for the meerkats, just getting a scorpion and you haven't had any practice before in dealing with a scorpion, where the sting really can actually be potent enough to kill not just a meerkat but a human potentially, there's a real danger there, that if you don't know what you're doing, then things could go quite wrong. And so potentially the reason we don't see teaching in species like chimpanzees and the other great apes is that there's not that much evidence that the kinds of skills that could conceivably be taught are that crucial for survival. So for example, in chimpanzees, one of the things that has been held up as a putative example of teaching is using a stone tool to crack a nut, for example, or using a stick to fish termites out of the root of a tree. And so some people have said, oh, it seems like the mothers might be teaching the offspring how to do this. They're teaching them how to use a stone to crack a nut, or they're teaching them how to use this stick to get termites out of a tree. And I think the reason why the evidence isn't that strong in these cases, that there is actually any active instruction on the part of the female, is that, first of all, those kinds of food items are quite niche items in a chimpanzee's diet. Most of what a chimpanzee eats is stuff that it can very easily get for itself, like ripe fruit and leaves, and things like nuts and insects are just not that common items in a chimpanzee's diet. And the second thing the reason why we probably haven't got any really concrete examples of teaching in the other great apes is that the great apes are really, really good, what we call social learners. So they're really good at watching what another individual is doing, and then copying that action for themselves and learning that technique for themselves. And they actually, to learn how to crack a nut, or to learn how to fish termites with a stick from a tree, a young chimpanzee might not actually need any active instruction. They might be able to learn what to do just by sitting near an older individual, their mother usually, and observing what that individual does, and then working it out for themselves. And so there just might not be the selection pressure that we see in other species there to favouring that change in behaviour on the part of the teacher, the putative teacher.
Yeah, for instance, like in the case of an ant, if it doesn't know where it's going, then it might not be able to help the colony. So it's like they might just get lost. Or they just, yeah, for instance, and if you do that for every single ant, you don't have any ants left. But
Right.
like you
Yeah.
said with a chimp, like you can, there's other sources of food and sustenance, and that might
Hmm.
not be as important. So yeah, I mean that makes total sense. One of the things you talked about in the book as well, on the fact of sort of cooperation, is you talked about the relationship between interdependence and reciprocity. Why does interdependence allow cooperation to thrive in a society, or in a group of individuals?
Yeah, so this is kind of something I guess that's gaining more prominence recently, although the idea has been around for quite a long time actually. But the classic sort of view of how cooperation could be favored among individuals that aren't related to each other and where they don't have a vested interest in the genes in that other individual's body. One of the key ideas has been this idea of reciprocity, which is you can kind of sum it up as being you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, tit for tat, quid pro quo, all these kinds of sayings sort of
Mm.
encapsulate this idea of reciprocity. And for a long time, it was the kind of dominant view was that reciprocity was one of the key ways to explain how cooperation could ever be favored among individuals that weren't related to one another. And it's this idea of conditionality that I'll help you on the condition that you'll help me. And the way that I get a benefit from me investing and helping you is that you, in return, will help me. And reciprocity is probably quite important in helping us to understand how cooperation evolves among non relatives. But I think that we have potentially also overlooked a simpler mechanism that doesn't have this same conditionality embedded in it, which is this idea of interdependence, which is where two partners or two individuals or many individuals that interact can actually end up having a stake in one another's fitness or in one another's well-being, such that if you and I are interdependent, it actually is in my interest to help you because you being around, not you paying me back, but just you being around is somehow beneficial to me and is somehow going to yield a return benefit to me in the future. By the way, obviously people aren't thinking about this in a conscious, calculated way. We're talking about evolutionary,
Yeah,
we're talking about the evolution of helping behavior here, not the psychological mechanisms underpinning helpful behavior, which are quite different.
yeah,
One of the way that I describe it in the book, which I think helps to sort of illustrate the analogy in a way, is if you think about if you were in a boat, you were in a rowing boat with another person, and the boat sprung a leak, and it required both of you to be able to bail out the water if the boat isn't going to sink. In that situation, you suddenly become really interdependent on your partner, and it's in your interest that your partner is feeling strong and well enough to continue bailing out the boat because them being able to do that is also directly affecting your chances of
yeah,
survival. And so it might pay you, in fact, to if you have some food or something like that, it might be your best option to share that food with that individual, even if there's no chance that they're going to pay you back in future. There's no tit for tat, there's no quid pro quo. The benefit to you is that you now have a stake in their welfare and it's in your interest that they feel okay and that they're able to keep on bailing out water, for example. So that's obviously
yeah.
like a silly example, but that helps to illustrate this how you can get cooperation even when you don't expect a return that to be paid back to you in that way by the partner.
Do you think as society as a whole becomes more globalized, do you think it moves from more reciprocity to interdependence? Because, for instance, when I observe something like climate change, and it's not something that just affects one person in one country, it affects everyone. So there requires a level of interdependence from someone in India to someone in China to someone in the US or the UK. So do you feel like with some of the global challenges that we have at the moment, it will move, cooperation has to move to a state of interdependence?
That's a really interesting question. And I think, I actually think like one of the biggest threats that we face, or one of our biggest collective challenges, is that we often fail to recognize that we are interdependent when we are interdependent. And
Yeah.
so the COVID is like a really good example of that, where, with the, if on this question of how vaccines ought to be distributed globally versus kept parochially within the country, I think there is a real failure to realize the extent to which we actually are all really interdependent in this situation, and that the success of no country can have an individual success. If every country hasn't somehow got this under control, then no country is going to get it under control.
Yeah.
And I think the same goes for, like you said, with climate change, that we really are fundamentally interdependent here. And if we can't recognize that, then that is a huge obstacle to being able to tackle these global public goods problems. And I actually think that often it somehow we don't see that interdependence, or we can easily mistake relationships that are interdependent for relationships that are more transactional, or more based on sort of tit for tat, quid pro quo, and things like that. Yeah, that is a really interesting question, actually.
Yeah, the reason why I thought about that was because I was observing sort of how interdependent individuals are in my own life. So, for instance, I thought about in the work environment, and sometimes in the work environment, people think it's reciprocal in the fact that you do something for someone and they do something for you. But it's like, well, if someone doesn't do their job correctly, imagine if you're in a team of individuals and you've got a project. If someone doesn't do their part, it's not the fact that it's not reciprocal, is you're interdependent. You're dependent on them doing their role, because your reputation, the benefit that's going to happen for you and the quality of the project is going to be dependent on the
Yeah, you have
individuals.
a shared fate.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. There's a shared fate, and I feel like that is everyone in society has a shared fate for the
Yeah,
survival of the society as a whole.
yeah, I think you're right, and maybe that is one of the big questions: is how do you, on a psychological level, how do you help people to become aware of that interdependence, and to appreciate that interdependence? Because I think it's not obvious that I think it's not actually intuitively obvious that you're interdependent with somebody in a country that you've never met, in a way, like in the
Yeah,
situation that we're in now. It's actually quite hard to appreciate that interdependence. It's very obvious to know, for me, it's obvious that I'm interdependent with my husband, and we have a shared, we raise these children together, and we know we rely on each other and things like
yeah.
that. But it's not sometimes if uh, it's not so easy to appreciate, I think, interdependence in these much more distal connections.
Yeah, not just due to geographic situations, but also just due to ideological differences or whatever it might
Mm.
be, cultural differences. It's very difficult to have that. But my belief is as we become more connected, I think that it's going to become more important to have that viewpoint, because I don't think I don't think it's possible to survive cooperatively as a species if we don't do have that interdependence. For some of those challenges, there's sort of a couple of things I want to touch upon before we end. One of them was the concept of free riders and how that undermines cooperation in the long term. I know in economics there's this term of free riders, those individuals that use the system to their advantage but don't contribute back to the system. So can you just talk about why free riders, whether they be individuals or a group of individuals, undermine the basis for cooperation in the long term?
Yeah, so essentially, well, I'll describe it with an experiment, actually, because this is an experiment that I did
Okay.
on my poor work colleagues that they never really forgave me for. But in the workplace, we had a tea room, a staff tea room, and it had a sink. And as anyone who's been, ever shared a sink will appreciate, it's kind of a big challenge to keep that thing clean, and
Student
make sure
accommodation.
that, yeah, exactly. So it
Yeah.
always ends up that someone's going to leave something in there, and what happens when they do that. And so to sort of test this idea of or to kind of test this idea that free riding begets free riding in a real world public goods dilemma, I I snuck into the department early for a few weeks and just manipulated basically the state of the public good by either completely cleaning it and leaving it free of any items whatsoever, or leaving variable numbers of spoons and cups and things like that in the sink. And the results are really unsurprising to anyone, obviously, that's ever shared a sink or anything like that with other people. If
Yeah.
the sink starts out clean, it basically stays clean through the day, more or less. Whereas the addition of one item can spark a downward spiral of defection, of further free riding by other people. And so, in a way, free riding in this case, by leaving your dirty item in the sink, we kind of said there's a twofold cost here of free riding. One is that you're damaging the public good. So the sink that was clean is now not clean because you've left your item in there. And then the additional cost is you're now also converting people who might otherwise be prepared to wash up their cup or their spoon or whatever into free riders, because they see evidence of free riding there, and they if they are what's known as conditional cooperators, that only cooperate if they think other people are doing the right thing, they will actually be more likely to then free ride and leave their own dirty item in the sink. And so we call that the twofold cost of free riding. And I think, we see evidence of that, not just in tea room sinks and things like that, but there are so many examples of where evidence of free riding in our real world cooperative dilemmas which we face hundreds of on a daily basis, where we see evidence of free riding, it can prompt people to also then free ride themselves.
Yeah, I mean, one of the situations in which I observe that is if you go to a country where it's very clean, it remains very clean, and the habitants of that area make it very incumbent upon everyone to ensure that it remains that way. But if you go to somewhere else where it's like there's rubbish everywhere, people are very easy to throw rubbish out because it's like, well, it's going to be anyway, kind of thing, and it's just the state of nature. So I think that's where perhaps the lines are blurred between the individual's prevalence for doing something and then just the society at large and their environment. One of the things I actually wanted to end on this question, because I think it's a very interesting one, I'd love to get your take on it, is what do you think are the biological factors that will allow human cooperation to continue to flourish into the future?
I think we are fundamentally we are driven to cooperate. And so yes, some of our prosociality is learned and is influenced by the environment in which we develop, and is influenced by maybe the norms of the culture or the society that we live in. But on a quite fundamental level, there are some elements of prosociality that are just baked in, that are there from birth, or from as early as we can measure them. And I think we are, there's a really great quote actually by an anthropologist called Sarah Blaffer Hardy, and she's talking about just the fundamental difference between humans, say, and chimpanzees, our closest living relatives on Earth. And she uses this idea of going on a plane journey, and how different would it be if she was on a plane with a bunch of chimpanzees on a transatlantic flight rather than a group of humans. And I think it goes something like, I would be lucky to disembark with all my fingers and toes intact. And, it would be a bloodbath essentially. And, there's so much that we take for granted about just how tolerant and cooperative as a species that we are. And I think that, those fundamental, the basics are there in place, and lots of the variation in what we see in human cooperation is driven by the norms of the society that we find ourselves in, and is quite malleable, therefore, and it can be changed. And maybe that's kind of a hopeful ending in a way, is that nothing is that pro-social tendencies are there, they're baked in, but nothing is really set in stone. Like, we can change our we can change our cooperative natures. We can also become more cooperative, or we can scale up cooperation to different levels. And we have done that repeatedly throughout our past. And hopefully we will continue to find new ways to cooperate that help us to solve these huge global challenges that we now face. And I think, we do have the capacity to do that. And whether we do it or not is kind of up to us.
I think, I mean, it might just be more of a situational thing based on the factors or the challenges that we have to overcome. And it's more like perhaps it's not a choice, it's just a matter of having to do it, just because it's, I mean, survival.
Yeah, although, there's plenty of examples of us failing as well. So Easter Island, and, there are quite, I guess we shouldn't, my main thing I think I say at the end of the book is we should be hopeful but not complacent, because we've seen that, many human societies in the past have failed because they've not managed to resolve these kind of global dilemmas that they've faced. So it's not a given that we're going to solve a problem like climate change or something like that, but we can do it. But it's not, we need to be motivated to do it, and we need to work to make that happen.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's a great way to end it. So thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your book, The Social Instinct, How Cooperation Shaped the World. It's a pleasure to speak to you about the book, and I think the book is great to understand how cooperation has shaped our world, both from a genetic point, but also from society at large. Where's the best place for anyone who's interested about you or the book? Where's the best place to find you, on social media or a website?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Nichola Raihani, my full name. I also have a website called the Social Evolution and Behaviour Lab, which if you just Google Social Evolution and Behaviour Lab, you'll find there's all the information about our research and publications and things like that on there. So those are two places.
Perfect. I'll link those in the description, so if anyone wants to find them out, they can find it. Like I said, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.